Hello and welcome to the fourth Time for a Pint Virtual Get Together. I'm your host, Chris Mann. You've probably heard me on podcasts. You've met me at Watch Get Togethers if you've come along. You've hopefully seen the last three of these. We have assembled four of us together for this Sunday for some watch nerdery. I have my wonderful co-host, Matt. Hello, Matt.
Afternoon.
Would you like to introduce a guest?
I would. The first guest today is Jonas, WatchesRecordsPeanutbutter on Instagram, if you're not already following him. Jonas has the dubious title of being both a podcast guest on Time for a Pint and an interviewer on Time for a Pint, so he should be pretty good at this. He's a watch collector and yeah, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be, and delighted and surprised to be invited back, but happy to be here, and I hope everyone's doing well.
Good to see you. Our other guest for today is Eric Wind. Some of you may recognise his face. Hopefully lots of you will recognise his voice from one of the earlier episodes of the Time for a Pint podcast, where we got together in Karlsruhe in Germany with the help of Balázs from Fratello and Chrono24 at the Chrono24 Get Together. Welcome along, Eric.
Thanks, Chris, for having me back.
Thank you so much for joining us. So for anybody that hasn't watched or listened or seen before, the way this is going to work is the four of us have each picked a watch from our collections to bring along and talk about. Everyone sent in nice big photographs. I've put them into a slide deck, and we're going to take turns talking through those watches and taking questions from each other, and also taking questions from you folks in the chat. So while you can use the chat, it scrolls through really fast. So if you have questions about a particular watch as it comes up, please use the Q&A. We've got about an hour to talk. So let's go. Let's do this. Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. So let's see if we can do this without any more technical difficulties. So let me just share the screen. And here we go. So the first watch up today is Eric's. So over to you, Eric. Just let me know when you want me to click through on the slides.
Okay, you can click. This is a Heuer, which is probably a reference 2406. The Heuer watches from that era did not have a reference number engraved on the case, so you have to look at old catalogs that Jeff Stein bought over the years on eBay and sort of compiled on the dash.com. This is an interesting watch from a technical perspective. It's from probably 1939. You'll see the engraving in a second that it was purchased in 1940. Around that time, the biggest challenge for chronograph manufacturers was trying to make water-resistant chronographs. Of course, we have Gallet around that time came out with the clamshell cased chronograph where there were 4 screws. And then you have this, and Universal Geneve had also sort of tried this approach, which was a more intense compression case back. And then with these rounded, what we would call mushroom pushers, these are sort of very primitive hand-formed pushers. Of course, later versions we see are sort of machined in a more precise way. But this is, a very interesting early approach of a water-resistant chronograph. And then it has a non-luminous dial, which means, no radium on the dial or in the hands. You can go 2 slides. This watch, based on the engraving on the back, was originally purchased by Lyle G. Trory from Vancouver, British Columbia. He was involved in World War II and oversaw mapping and aerial surveying for the Canadian Army. He was also involved in some classified projects for the War Office related to radar development, and basically was awarded an MBE at the end of the war for his efforts. He returned to Canada and became a pioneer in photogrammetry and sort of aerial surveying. He wrote a book that was published by the University of Cambridge in 1952 that sort of became the textbook about that field. And you can keep going through, Chris. We have a copy of his obituary here, which took a bit of finagling to find. And then you can go to the last photo. It's on top of his book, which that copy was actually owned by the United States Navy and was part of one of their libraries that accompanies the watch. I really appreciate these early chronographs. Obviously, I like watches with stories and provenance, and this sort of does it all for me.
I think we had a couple of questions come in beforehand, one about the size and the other about the movement.
Yeah, so the size it's about 35, but I'd say it wears more like 36 and a half. It's a very robust cased watch, and sort of shape and feel, it's very similar to the Patek Philippe 1463, which is the only vintage water-resistant chronograph they made. I really love that watch just in general. I'm not sure who made the case in this era. The steel watches typically for chronographs did not have any sort of hallmark or case manufacturer, typically. But the only way we can often identify something like a Charles Rodolphe Spillman case is by looking at the same case in gold, because the gold cases had hallmarks. So I'm not sure who made this. It probably was not an FB case, because those were marked with the FB and a key. That's Francois Bourgel, which later became Taubert and Frere. They're the company who made the 1463 case and a number of Movado cases during that time. And then the movement is a Langeron 13 movement. It is from a period when Langeron made very high quality movements. It is not the Langeron movements we know from the 1950s, where they were sort of very cheap, almost disposable chronographs. It's from when it was a true column wheel, very, very nice movement, and there weren't many chronograph movement manufacturers during that time in the late 30s. And then we just have a question here about the hallmarks on the top left lug. That is the last 3 digits of the case number that is on the inside case back. So I think it was 038. And then if you look on the inside case back, that's repeated as the last 3 digits. So it was to make sure the case back and case stay together during production.
Interesting. Any questions from the panel or anything else in the Q&A, Matt?
There's a question in the Q&A about how long you've had this, Eric, and where you found it.
I found it from a collector. I had been pursuing it for a while. And he had bought it from basically a sort of a dealer who had gotten it from a picker, I think, or gotten it off eBay. So it had, decent private provenance, and it is for sale. I'm a watch dealer, but I had the watch serviced by really excellent watchmaker, Alkis Katsopoulos in New York. So the watch is really in good shape.
Great. Any other questions from the panel, or on to the next?
And then, just one other dial detail.
Okay.
I really like the squashed Heuer logo, which they used sort of late 30s through very early 40s before they made the logo sort of wider in what we know today when we think of these watches. It was just sort of an interesting little anomaly in their logo that I really like.
Very cool. Fantastic. Okay, so I think it is Jonas's turn.
Sure.
So,
yeah, well, this is Universal Geneve Tri-Compax, and it's a watch that people will know, I suppose, because it's so unique looking, and I think the layout is so unique looking, and those hands, despite being on lots of other watches, I just think they belong with this watch in many ways. And so it's this particular watch is probably from around 1946, I think, from the serial number. It's steel. The reference is 22536. The Tri-Compax, which is written above the subdial at 6, was launched in 1944 at the Basel Watch Fair by Universal to commemorate their 50th anniversary. And so this was kind of their rollout, throw the pimp down, 50th anniversary piece. And it's complicated, but now I always think with triple calendars, because I love them, but I'm always surprised that they seem to be somewhat unloved. It may have to do with servicing, it may have to do with finding parts, but it is a sort of poor man's perpetual calendar, basically. You have to do a lot more work in sort of setting the month and date quite often, and moon phase. But I'm surprised that they aren't more popular. But I absolutely love this design, and this particular watch is 36.5 millimeters, which for a Tri-Compax from the 40s is actually quite large. They got larger over time. The ones from the 50s and 60s and into going onwards are bigger than this and have bulkier, sort of sportier case designs. But there's something about these that I just really like from the 40s. And so before we move on, the Tri-Compax refers to the functions of the watch rather than 3 subdials. And it's a bugbear of mine. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, to be honest, but a lot of chronographs with 3 subdials are referred to as Tri-Compax layout. And I don't know if that's correct or not. I always think it's probably wrong. But so the tri refers to the complications. So chronograph, calendar, moon phase. So a bit of background then, if we go on to the next slide, this is a watch owned by Ben Clymer, founder of Hodinkee, and he wrote this article in 2012 about this particular watch that he bought from the Fullerton estate in an auction, and paid a ludicrously low price for, close to $2,500 US, and with its heritage obviously would go for a lot more now. But I was just mesmerized when I read that article and looking at this piece, and you can already see some of the differences. I think this is a 34 mil version, but despite a similar layout, different numerals, different case, and just a different looking piece, despite having the same hands to mine. I mean, the 7 is a work of art, frankly. So are all the numerals, frankly. They're just gorgeous. 7 and the 4 in particular are just lovely. But it set me off. And I, from that moment on, started keeping an eye out for them and sort of going through phases of looking quite heavily for one in steel with these hands, and then wanting the right size for it, because I think for 34 mil, it's a little bit too small for me, even with my twiglet wrists. Or you just need very good eyes to tell what the date is, because it's hard. So I started looking for them, and if you go onto photo 3, you can see the huge variety that exists, and these are all watches from 1944 to 1950. There are, and people will know, they went on to make many other varieties, but it just shows you how much variety exists within those 6 years. It's absolutely mad. So all of these watches have a different case from one another, different materials, different hands, different sizes. And so it's a little bit bewildering. It's not uncommon to see the same reference number showing either a different dial or different handset. And so you kind of need to familiarize yourself with them. I said before when we started, and I'll say again, there's a great set of reference guides from Timepiece Chronicle. If you Google Timepiece Chronicle Universal Geneve Tri-Compax, you'll find this set of reference guides that are incredibly thorough, and they go in decades, so 40s, 50s, 60s. People will know the Eric Clapton 60s one, but there are really a vast selection of variations on a theme of these sorts of watches. And so that's a really good place to start. Eric has written something about them as well, as have others. And I just think they're a really fascinating, slightly underappreciated reference for reasons that I don't fully understand. But what we can see just looking at these before we come back to my watch is a few similarities. So all rectangular pushers, more or less silver dials in the main. Eric interjected earlier to say there is a genuine black dial one out there. I haven't handled it. What size was it, Eric?
I want to say 35.
Really? God, I'd love to see that or own one of those.
Given how many there are, given how many designs there are, is it difficult to work out what is legit, or are all of these legitimate?
I don't know. Like, say the one top row in the middle, those hands look unusual to me, and that looks like a restored dial to me. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard. I think you can almost just use your eye just to see what's right and wrong with UG, because their quality control was pretty good. They were distributed by Henry Stern in the US, and they were distributing Patek at the time. And I just think that at this early stage, their quality control was so good that stuff didn't look wrong. It matched. Things tended to look right on a watch. And so it's difficult. I don't know of that much scholarship, particularly around handsets, that can really guide you. So I think you kind of have to trust your eye a little bit with them, but it's hard, because these are all, as I say, these are all watches released within 6 years of one another. And so, you know, there's a great deal of variety there. They have anonymous crowns. Sorry, Eric, sorry, you're going to say.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, you know, you have to kind of look at a couple things. Obviously, you can look at the reference number online to see others that may have popped up. There's variety within references, but, you know, a couple things that are very basic, that just to make sure that you don't have non-luminous hands with a luminous style or vice versa.
Yeah.
And that the minute hand, speaking of the quality control, usually extends right onto the track, not over and not before. You'll often see swapped hands that are either way too short or too long. So a couple of quick things to look at when you're looking at a watch.
Well, this is when I realised that my minute hand is probably replaced as we go on to the next photo. So this is the watch that I ended up getting. And it took me a while. It took me a while to find like the exact reference that I wanted. So this is reference 22536. And I wanted a steel watch with a slightly larger size, although, as I say, I think it wears a little bit smaller than 36.5 personally. And I just think it's a very beautiful and balanced package, considering the amount of data that it is conveying at any one time. You've got obviously the time, day of the week, month, date, moon phase, chronograph, potentially tachometer as well. And so there's a lot going on. But I just think it really achieves what it sets out to do, and just it makes it very readable really, really quickly. Some of the oddities in the 40s ones, as you can see at the subdial, the minute, chronograph minute subdial at 3, the increments are in minutes of 3. So you've got 3, 6, 9, 12, etc. going on there. And whilst many chronographs of the time, like Angelus, for example, had those very prominent red hashes on their chronograph subdial minutes, they've just fully gone in for the 3-minute increments, which I'm told is to do with timing telephone calls. But it's just a really cool little quirk that you might not notice straight away. And the other thing that I find quite weird the longer I've spent with this watch is the sizing of the subdials, because they're not all the same size. You've got the top 3, as it were, that I think are about the same size, and then just a massive hour counter at the bottom, which is probably actually the easiest one to see and the one you're going to use the least. But it's just this outsized counter at the bottom with different fonts. There are different fonts all over the place. It's one of the hallmarks of these UGs. You've got kind of open 6s and open 9s in the hour counters, but then elsewhere flat 3s and all the other sort of weird typography terms that we use as watch collectors. So I think it's quite interesting.
Definitely.
So yeah, if we yeah, you can see there are splashes of red in the 31 and the date counter. And the dial is massive too. It takes up so much real estate. It's got this very, very steep bezel that makes it, I suppose, look a bit bigger. But if you look at the side profile, which is the next photo, you can see that the lugs, which look quite dainty top down, are actually quite thick. They're almost, in a way, a bit like Carrera lugs, in a way, because they're actually much deeper than they look. And you can see it's actually quite a thick watch. So it doesn't wear as dainty as it might seem. And maybe that's sort of the DNA of the sports watch that it was later to become. But it's got this really pleasing sort of pebbly feel on your wrist, because it's actually quite round, domed plexi, as you would think. And so it has a bit of wrist presence if you get it in this size. If we go on one further, this is the case back. And so that top line is the serial number and the bottom line is the reference number. And as I said, when I came on the podcast for the first time, the reference numbers for Universal Geneve are quite interesting, because that bottom 22536 gives you information about the watch. And so it's a way of verifying what you're buying. So the first number is case material, so steel 2, gold is 1. Second number is the type of movement, 1 meaning time only, 2 meaning chronograph. So you've got a steel chronograph. Third number is the size of the base plate, which is 5. So nice large movement inside. And the last 2 are the case design. And so it's just the sort of thing that if you're going to look for one of these, it's nice to know, and you can kind of match up case backs with movements and the size of it. Next 2 photos are basically just gratuitous wrist shots. Oh no, there's a movement. Okay, that's the movement. That's what the movement looks like. It's not decorated like a Patek, but to be honest, with this sort of watch, I don't really mind. It does a job, and actually this runs really well. It came to me serviced. I bought it about 3 years ago, so it's due a service soonish. And I know somebody asked earlier about sourcing parts, and getting it serviced is not easy. I know it's not easy, but I think that's part of the punishment you get for buying a watch like this. You need to be signed up for the fact that it's going to be off your wrist for a while, and they may have to find some really obscure lever or wheel for it. But so far, so good. And you can see just to the right of the chronograph bridge, there's a little 287 embossed there onto one of the plates, and so that lets you know where it is. So the next 2 shots, I think, are just gratuitous wrist shots, and it just wears really well, and it's a really nice piece that I've enjoyed wearing a lot. And
I saw these 2 pictures earlier, and I'm going to click through to the next one because ultimately in my head they're just you showing off the different types of trousers you have. So
right,
blue trousers
shorts,
here,
mate, please. Yeah.
and then different shorts.
yeah. Well, I'm just constantly taking photos of it. I just love having it on my wrist, and there's something about this watch that I just think, even to someone who doesn't know anything about watches, it's just a really interesting watch. The final thing I'll say is, if there's one final photo, I think this is okay. Ignore the Heuer, but it's you can see there's the face on the moon, which I love, which has seemed to go out of fashion in, like, I think the 50s or 60s. I love the little face on the moon, but the moon phase disc is also turned brown, which they tend to on some of these Tri-Compaxes. Just a nice little detail. But you can see, if you look at the lugs, it has those little teeth on the inside, which means you need very particular spring bars. I don't know if they're called female spring bars or negative spring bars or whatever they are, but just you should be aware of that if you're buying some of these UGs from the 40s. They tend to have those little teeth, and it can make changing straps a bit of a bitch, basically. So that's that.
Cool. Any questions, Matt? Any questions in the chat or in the Q&A?
There's one question in the Q&A, which is what original strap this might have come on. I'm guessing kind of pigskin leather or whatever.
Yeah, I have
it's
no
cool
idea.
in the 40s, but
Yeah, pigskin or like an alligator crocodile kind of thin strap.
I've sort of toyed with the idea of trying to put it on a bracelet, but it's one of those watches that I just think needs to be on a leather strap.
It looks really cool.
Think, yeah, it's a beauty, and I think it would get swamped by a proper bracelet.
Hard to fit bracelets on that type of spring bar as well, because you have to kind of loop it over. So it's very tricky.
Thank goodness I haven't tried.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
You mentioned, Jonas, that sort of the beginnings of like sports watch DNA in some of these, and seeing the screen where there was it 9 of them together or 6 of them together?
Yeah.
And to me, it feels like any of the ones that haven't got applied numerals or applied markers feel really sporty. Like anything with printed numbers and loom on the dial and big hands, it feels like a sports watch rather than a dress watch, even if it is a bit smaller than we'd maybe expect in a modern sports watch.
Yeah, I think the 60s ones, which have lyre lugs and bigger cases and Eric Clapton with exotic dials, go and have a look at, I'm sure many people follow Basamu on Instagram. He has a gorgeous 60s exotic dial one that has a similar case to a Speedmaster and a bezel, an aluminium bezel. And that is a really rugged looking kind of sporty watch.
Yeah, he bought that from me.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Why didn't you offer it to me, Eric? I couldn't have afforded it. Don't worry.
I love those space compactors as well, with the rubber pushes.
One thing I was going to say, Jonas, is the hands I also really like on your watch, and they're sort of unique to the model because alpha hands sort of taper from there's a little taper, and then they sort of go from the post toward a point. And these are often called kite hands because it's more that straight in the middle, it goes out like a kite. So it's really, really an interesting geometric design.
Yeah, I think it's the highlight of the piece in many ways. I don't think they're as nice when they have other hands, personally. But yeah, anyway, thank you for listening.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody for their patience. So anybody who's watching the recording of this right now, I'm going to fess up and say this is the second time that we've had Eric and Jonas talk through their watches, because we had a bit of what can only be described as a technical fart earlier on, where everything just broke. So thanks to everybody who's with us live for suffering a bit of a Groundhog Day moment, and thanks to Eric and Jonas for remembering all the details that they talked through the first time for the second time. Matt, are there any more questions? Anything that we need to cover with Jonas's watch?
I don't think so.
Okay. So we are on to brand new territory for everybody now. So this is Matt's watch next, I think.
Beauchat HPS watches. So I'm going to bring the tone down. We've been looking at fantastic vintage watches so far, both from Eric and Jonas, and I'm going to take you back to a different time, a few years on, the 80s, early 90s, and a little bit of deep space exploration, except that instead of going up, this is about going down. So HPS watches are hydraulic pressure system watches, and if we click on the first, you'll see this is the hydraulic pressure system, 6,000 meters abyssal from Beauchat. Abyssal because the abyssal zone is 4,000 meters down to God knows where, probably where hadal zones begin. And you can tell from the bubble on the left-hand side that this isn't a normal quartz watch either. So if you flick onto the next one, that bubble is because there's liquid surrounding the entire mechanism. So it's a quartz watch, single jewel quartz watch, pretty simple. Time only, obviously, with that second hand. But the oil was an idea that Beauchat had about the same time as Sin, Bell and Ross, to combat pressure in dive watches. So where you've got a dive watch with a normal case air, it's quite compressible, which means that as the pressure acts, as you get deeper, it's going to get squished. Oil being incompressible avoids that, but obviously it means you can't have a mechanical watch. I have been trying to talk to people about a mechanical oil-filled watch, but I'm just struggling to get people to take me seriously. Aren't I always? So next picture, if you don't mind. As you'd expect from a dive watch, it's got a tiny crown, which means it's almost impossible to use with gloves. And one imagines if you ever do get to dive to 6,000 meters, or actually it's tested to 125%, so 7,500 meters, you'd really struggle to undo the crown and do it back up again, given that you'd probably be in some kind of massive pressure suit with those claws. So I don't think they really thought much about the design when they were putting this one together. And it might explain why Beauchat as a watch manufacturer doesn't really exist anymore. Next slide. Right, so this is the case back. You can see a couple of things here. On the left-hand side, you see it's brevet depot. So basically that's the patent. And each of these watches has a serial number, and then that M104SP is the test that was undertaken by IFREMA. So IFREMA is a bit like kind of Woods Hole Institute, one of those other marine exploration places. It stands for, and I did write this down, the Institut Français de Recherche pour l'exploitation de la mer. So IFREMA tested these things in amazing tanks, similar to the Comex tanks and the tanks that Rolex now use to test their mechanical watches. So this one was tested to 7,500 meters or 750 atmospheres, which is quite impressive. You might be asking yourselves a question at this point. If it's a dive watch, why has it got holes in the case? That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that one. So let's flick over. I haven't taken the back off my watch. The reason I haven't taken the back off is because unusually it's still full of oil. And although I need to get it serviced, I don't really want to waste that at the moment. So this is somebody else's from the internet. You can see that it's a simple one jewel ISA quartz. All those gaps would have been filled with oil. You can see a plastic spacer and a little gap. Literally, you just dunk it in oil, get it all filled. And then the question becomes, how do I keep that oil safe? And also, although it's incompressible, how do I stop it expanding with heat? One of the great things about oil-filled watches is, especially if you've got a wobbly O-ring on your crown, they'll leak all over your wrist, because your wrist warms up the oil, it expands and starts filling out and just pouring out the watch. So in the next picture, the way that Beauchat did it was a simple ring and diaphragm. So inside the case, there's that stainless steel ring and a rubber diaphragm that basically clamps onto the top of the oil, screws down, and can allow for a little bit of thermal expansion. It also means that the water acts directly on the diaphragm rather than the case, so the pressure is far better equalized. Final pictures. So obviously Beauchat was selling these to proper divers who wanted to go down to 6,000 meters at least. But they did make a baby version. So this is the Beauchat Genesis 4,000 meters watch. As you can tell, it's still a dive watch with those beautiful raised bits on the bezel to help you turn it, and horned lugs. I think everyone would agree with me that number one, a horned lug, and number two, a leather strap is ideal for any serious tool watch. If you're going to take it underwater to the hail zones, for example, strapped to the side of your submarine, this is exactly what you need. But seriously, the next picture shows you that it's a clear dial, and this one doesn't have any bubble. And that's because I haven't tried to do anything silly yet and take it out, take out the crown or take off the back. The cool thing about them, actually, and if we flick onto the next picture, I don't know if people have bought, I mean, obviously everyone's got an LED and LCD TV by now, but when you first got your plasma or flat screen, you would have noticed that you can see it from 170, 175 degrees. You can watch it side on. If you take a dive, normal watch diving, because there's air between the crystal and the dial, as soon as it gets underwater and you start tilting it around, you get that diffraction and it kind of goes mirror-like and you can't read it. These you can read at almost all angles because there is no diffraction. There's no, the light doesn't have to go through the air to hit the dial. So they're actually quite useful. But I do think that the lugs on them are just beautiful. I mean, I have no idea why someone thought that kind of 1940s throwback to a horn lug would sit well on a dive watch, but I'm so glad they did. I think that's probably it. Unless there are any questions.
I have questions. I mean, the first one is probably why. Like, why did someone do this? What was going on in the 80s or 90s to lead to this level of crazy?
It's a really good question. The one thing I can think of is that in 1984-85, Bob Ballard took a couple of boats out, a couple of submarines out, and started looking for the Titanic and a couple of submarines that had also sunk. So there was probably a little bit of people thinking about what they might do about that, and it was probably the biggest thing in underwater exploration since the Bath escapes and the Trieste. So perhaps that's the kind of thing that triggered it. Certainly, a framer had been involved in 1984 in those Bob Ballard expeditions, and it's strange that towards the end of the 80s and early 90s, 3 people came up with this idea in slightly different ways. Bell and Ross and Sin seem to have worked together. Sin still produce a number of Hydra watches, although Bell and Ross have stopped. The Bell and Ross Hydromax was an 11,000 meter watch, which is basically as deep as you're going to go, and as deep as the 5 Deeps expedition from last year got with Omega. The Hydromaxes do tend to leak a bit more than these. The best ones, I think, are probably the Sins, in that they're still being serviced by Sin. They're still available, I think, they're Hydros. And they're sensible kind of watches. They're kind of 1,000 or 2,000 meters, I think they are. So you're not going to get shrunk to that size. Probably just about that big.
Amazing. Are there any questions in the Q&A or the chat?
Why is there a bubble of air in it, and would that not cause more issues? So Rochelle's pointed out the bubble. So for Bell and Ross Sin in particular, they often have a bubble for the thermal expansion because the cases are metal and cannot expand in the same way as this. The Bell and Ross Hydromax used to have a rubber plug built into the case, which kind of allowed for an expansion, but didn't really seem to work, and quite often perished and leaked. And you'll also notice that in the Bell and Ross at 12 o'clock, there are a couple of holes that allow any small bubbles that are caused by either you taking out the crown and letting some air in, or oil out. Those two holes allow the bubbles to kind of get hidden behind the dial. In an ideal world, I don't think you'd have them, which is why I really don't want to mess with my Genesis. I just need to find someone with a small oil tank who's willing to change it for me.
Oh,
any more questions about these fascinating bonkers dive watches?
I'm curious as to what you think of the Resence, like the Resence oil fill watch. What do you think
Resence,
having owned one of these?
Exactly. So Resence isn't really about depth. Resence is about visibility, legibility. So the fact that they use an oil-filled dial, not a movement, but an oil-filled dial, means that you can see it at almost all angles. It just gets rid of that refraction. And creates this almost 2D effect to the dial, which I find really pleasing. I love Resence. I think Benoit is a genius. I do think there are some incredible mechanical things about that Resence as well. The fact that actually the rotating satellite dials within the main dial are being driven by magnets on top of mechanical movement is far more advanced than this silly little quartz. But there we are. Pippi's also said, presuming that Mobius have a very special, very expensive oil for this. I'm sure they do. Certainly watchmaking oils used to be more expensive than just about anything else you could buy on the open market. But I'm not going to go to Mobius for anything, not in the short term anyway.
Any more for any more? Have we worn out the chat with these watches, Matt? Have we broken the internet?
I don't think I've broken the internet. I've certainly worn people out. Let's move on. Christopher Mann, what have you brought today from your own personal collection?
So what I brought is another 1940s watch. So you've had a 35mm 1940s watch from Eric and a 36.5mm 1940s watch from Jonas. I have brought a 30mm 1940s watch, which, given the size of my wrist, is hilarious. This is an Omega CK 2300/1, and that means it's the first iteration of the 2300 case type. I've seen them up to 7 or 8, I think. I don't know what that means other than potentially batches, I suppose, because they all seem to have the same type of case, the same lugs, the same size. They, if they're like this one, they still have the original crown. And these were a standard size gentleman's watch. Despite what various sellers on the internet would have you believe, this is not a boy's size watch. This was a full-size manly man's watch. And there would be nothing wrong with a man of my size wearing this tiny little watch. It's got 16 millimeter lugs. It has required a very, very long Heuer strap on the last fitting so that I can wear it. And I wear this quite a lot. It came off of eBay. I bought it from the son of the original owner. He said his dad had worked for British Steel or the predecessor to British Steel in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and through into the 70s when he retired. And in the 1940s, he was doing deals with US steel manufacturers. So he was back and forth between the UK and the US quite a lot in the later half of the 1940s. And his son was fairly sure that that's where this watch had come from. It had been bought in the US, which when it was opened up made sense because there's the case back with the 2300/1, but the movement inside has an OGX stamp on it, which means this was a movement for export from Switzerland specifically to the United States. And sometimes you see these, you'll see movements with OGX on them, and they're in a case type and a dial type that you don't see anywhere outside of America. This one is a complete watch that was made in Switzerland and shipped to the US. That inside that little rectangular movement is an R17.8 SC. The SC stands for Central Seconds. It's got a 45-hour power reserve. When I got it, it didn't work. And thanks to James Harris, who we met back in the first one of these, for getting it back up and running. It did that delightful thing that 1940s watches do sometimes. They're fully serviced. The watchmaker has them running for a week. He gave it to me. 2 days later, it stopped working. I gave it back to him. The minute he took it in his workshop, it started working again. So it may be haunted. I don't know.
It's the dance of a vintage watch. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, damn you. And then he had it back, and he's like, I've tried everything, it works. And I was like, well, that's a relief. You obviously know what you're doing. It's just me. It's purely me. It's got really nice little thin lugs on it, which I love. I think I've taken a picture of them. They're really, really sharp. So they've got these kind of two big bevels on them. Down into little points. It sits really nicely on the wrist. Like, it's got a very smooth back on it, and I will put this on and forget about it. And I wear it quite a lot. I'm a little bit in love with these watches, and I was saying to the guys beforehand, before we started and failed to record this the first time, I was looking through eBay at Omega watches that were cheap, and found this and bought it, and then I started looking for more of them. And I've kind of come up with my own dial grading system, which starts off with I can read the time and progresses to it's totally illegible and destroyed, because you don't seem to see good dials with these. If I go back a couple of pictures, actually a forward of pictures, this is a picture of it on my wrist, and as you can see, there's a score mark on the dial from where either the hands have rubbed or someone has tried to take the hands off aggressively at some point. There are radium burns all over it. The radium in the hands is eating itself. This watch is probably not one you want to inhale too closely near, and you definitely don't want to put it in your mouth or do anything else ridiculous with it, because it would cause you serious damage.
Before you go on, can you go back to the movement? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure.
So James has asked a question in the chat. Kathleen's also put a PSA out saying, do not eat radium. She has to keep reminding us that.
I'm not eating radium, Kathleen. It's fine. It's fine.
Do not
Thank
lick
God
your
she
dials.
reminded us. I mean,
Thank
I
goodness.
would be munching that.
Don't lick your dials. So talk us through this rectangular movement that James in the chat has just noticed.
So what can I tell you about this? It's got a 45-hour power reserve. They made a lot of them. So there are various variations of this. So there is an R17.8 with a sub-second, one with a central second, a chronometer grade, an anti-magnetic, and then they change. So the way that the Omega movement naming changed, I think these become the 300 series in later watches. So they made these from about 1945. Yeah, 1945-ish, through until the 1960s, and I think the cases got bigger.
But the movement stayed rectangular.
The movement stayed rectangular, and they're in these great big spaces. And I don't know for certain. I've tried to read up about it. There's not many of us that are massively interested in these watches, but I believe it to be a variant on the T17 that is used for rectangular shaped watches. The T17 is interesting. It has a really, really long power reserve. It's like 65 hours or something, which I seem to remember reading wasn't bettered by Omega until the early 2000s or mid 2000s. But you see a lot of these where there's this sort of rectangular movement dropped into this round watch, and it's like, oh, that's weird. Was it made like that? And it's like, yes, absolutely, it was. It's just in a great big spacer. I guess
I think for a while, Longines as well and Omega found that this shape of movement allowed for the most efficient storage of energy, but also the most accurate. So Longines with many of their chronometers were square, these rectangular movements that they could regulate the most precisely for competition.
That's really interesting. Thank goodness someone here has some knowledge. I have 3 different small 30mm cased Omegas. None of them have the same movement in. So there's one with a 23.4 SC. There's another one whose movement I can't remember. They're all made about the same time. So the serial number on this the serial number range puts this between 1944 and 1947. It's at the earlier end of that, so it's probably 44, 45. Unless I get an extract of the archives for it, I won't know. I'm not massively inclined to do that beyond just being interested. But yeah, I think it's a fun watch. And these are like, most of the watches I have come from the bottom end of eBay, very frankly. I am cheap and I like to buy broken watches. There, I said it. There's no shame in that. And it does sometimes mean that you
Zero shame, man. There's no shame.
And it quite often means you get things from the family of the person who bought it the first time, because it's a broken watch that's been put in a drawer. It's not been messed around by anybody. There's not been someone like try to fix it or try to get it working again. It's just been left alone. And this was kind of, it ran a little bit and then it stopped, and I think it had a broken mainspring in it. It was filthy, like the movement was filthy. All the oils are dried up, and you can see just about like on the brass and bronze pieces, there's sort of some little bits of wear where the finishing is starting to go, but all the screw heads are pretty clean and clear. Like, no one had been in this watch for a long time. There's a couple of service etchings in the case back in that way that watchmakers used to do, and I think the most recent one was like 1950 something. So the guy I bought it from, I was like, oh, it's your dad's watch, do you not feel sentimentally attached to this? And he's like, no, it's a broken watch, I don't care, please give me some money. I was like, okay, we all attach to different things, I guess. But yeah, I think, go on.
Bill's just commented to say that the movements were also used in later marine standard non-diving watches. So I think he's agreeing that with Eric as well, that these have been used quite a lot. So you were showing us, sorry, before I interrupted, you were showing us some more dials, I think.
No, it was just the last dial picture of this. This is the radium that Kathleen is very wisely saying that no one should eat. I will reassure you, Kathleen, I'm not going to eat this watch. I enjoy wearing it too much. One of the other watches I've got has also got a radium dial, and the third one, which is with James Harris at the moment, which I brought with, again, a non-running watch from the bottom of eBay. I bought it, opened up the back, shook it a little bit, and then called him and said, a broken balance staff on a 1940s Omega is not a problem, right? Is it? And it just went silent at the other end of the phone. So I'm sure James is sort of currently crying about the fact that he agreed to take that watch off me. And at some point when he's had a chance, I know he'll either make something, which is part of what might come into like the servicing of your Universal, Jonas, is like you get to the point where you're working with watchmakers who have qualifications and the skill in remaking parts.
Yeah.
And I know he went to Switzerland recently.
It's expensive.
It is expensive, but it's the way to keep these watches alive.
I agree.
The manufacturers that have been out of that haven't existed for decades, and watches that they've not been spare parts for even longer. There is a sort of great relief. There are people like James and others who are kind of keeping those parts of the craft alive. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with the watchmaker that can get the parts off the shelf and put a watch back together. That's an amazing skill too, and I think we've all benefited from people that can do that. But sometimes you need to kind of call in the big guns and have someone that can look at a broken piece of watch that's not necessarily all there and be like, right, this is what this should look like. Let's get this working again. So we're fortunate to have people around that can do that sort of stuff.
Kathleen's noted that the burn patterns on the dial are oddly pretty. I tend to agree. Actually, I think it's got little nice scorches.
Yeah, I get the impression that the hands have sat in similar places for quite a long time. That photo has been edited a little bit to make it look a bit better, but there are distinct lines where the hands have sat. And the guy it came from said he remembered playing with it as a broken watch as a kid and sort of spinning the hands around. So
spinning the hands around, yeah.
I wonder if it's been like fiddled with and then stuffed back in a drawer for another 10 years.
It's also it's quite an interesting sort of early start to the arrow markers that you would see certainly into the 50s, like Seamaster, Rancheros, all of those. Like it's already there basically. That dial design,
that language, yeah.
You can see where it kind of all carries through, like right from the earliest stuff. I've got in a drawer somewhere, again from the bottom of eBay, a Labrador pocket watch. Labrador was one of the early brands that the company that became Omega, and Labrador was the slightly higher grade pocket watch movements than the Omega branded ones. And you can see in that dial from a watch that's from, I think it's like 1890, you can already see the stuff that is going to happen through the 20s and 30s and 40s and into the 50s. There's bits of their style that have just stayed. The logos change, but you can watch the progression. If you were to go and grab one from each year and line them up, you can see the little changes that are happening as it goes along. And it does seem, there does seem to be, like, the more you think about it, this sort of trend in Swiss watchmaking in particular of refining and changing bit by bit rather than anything totally crazy. I mean, you hit the 70s and sort of crazy.
Unless you're universal.
Happened.
Yeah, unless you're universal. And just release whatever you want for 4 years. So a couple of questions have also come in. Actually, another comment from Bill, who's been quite active tonight. He says the movement's also in the Omega top hat.
Yes.
Which is good. Lots of comments on finding yourself a good watchmaker. Finding someone to turn a staff's not easy. And if anyone knows a watchmaker that can find missing or broken parts, he's got an Omega 372 missing the jump seconds bit. Wow. So those synchro beats were awesome, but that's probably for another time. Question in the Q&A: are you wearing the Movember Chronoris? No. The Movember Chronoris is back in the safe. I'm trying to keep that as kind of pristine and unworn for whoever is lucky enough to own that next. So no, it's not getting much wear. I'll be honest with you, while I've been at home for now, 4 or 5 weeks, I think I got kicked out of the office 4 or 5 weeks ago. I don't really wear watches around the house. I'm quite clumsy and I tend to knock into things. So I have a very, very dented Fitbit and the watches are not on my wrist.
You just carry around a ship's chronometer with you at most times.
See, I knew you were going to bring this up. I'm not going to go and get it. So a bit of like insider gossip for people that are watching along. I accidentally bought a 8-day striking ship's clock on eBay last week that I thought looked interesting, and it had an opening bid of £55. Yes, Chris, accidentally had an opening bid of £55, and I thought, that's ridiculous, someone will buy this. And then I woke up and I had won an 8-day striking ship's clock made by Wempe, I think in the 1970s. No, Bill. See, Bill has got my back. Bill is saying there is nothing wrong with a ship's bell clock. I will say, Bill, the ones that you have are much more interesting and have a more historical background than this one. This is, someone asked this, I think maybe in the first or the second one of these we did, Where can you go and buy vintage watches? Where can you go and buy vintage clocks other than eBay? It's like, I don't know why everyone is so down on eBay. Like, I think all of us here have scored some fun, interesting stuff. Like, it is the world's marketplace, and maybe there's not as much as there used to be, but there's still interesting stuff out there, even if you do end up buying ship's bell clocks. You know, and again, just to big up James Harris, it arrived yesterday, and I took it out of the box and gently shook it, and there was the sound of bits that should not have been loose floating around in that thing. And over the phone, he guided me through taking the hands off, taking the dial off, opening up, and we just discovered that the bell was rattling around loose in it. So put it back together. So, you know, this is what good watchmakers are for. They will deal with your insane purchases and requests with a smile, and then you have to buy them some beers and pay them well for working on your watches. I saw your comment, Bill. I will get in touch with you and give you his details. He's worth talking to.
Henrik would love to see the H4 from John Harrison. I don't think any of us own that, but I'll see what I can do.
Sorry.
Where is that? That's in Greenwich, right?
Yeah, we might be able to. We won't be able to. Right. So, final question for Eric on the Q&A. What are your top 3 pieces of advice, Eric, if you don't mind? Top 3 pieces of advice for finding vintage watches. Best sources, top picks for 2020 pickups. Okay, I'm not sure you'll be able to get all that, but a couple of thoughts.
Yeah. So eBay is great. I wrote a buying guide, sort of basic buying guide on Hodinkee some years back. But if you really know nothing about vintage watches, you probably shouldn't be going on eBay unless you like throwing money away. Because if you're just starting out, then you really won't know what the heck you're looking at. You could buy reprinted dials, fake watch, plenty of outright fake watches representing to be, you know, Tudors or fake Tudor Rangers, etc., where the whole thing is fake. So you have to be careful there. Obviously, I think for someone who's just getting into it, you're better off paying a premium to get it from a place that's reputable, whether that's a dealer or an auction house. You know, online auctions for Christies, Sotheby's, etc., or a reputable dealer, depending on what you're buying. You know, if you're looking for a Rolex, or good dealers for those. If you're looking for Heuers, good dealers for those, Omegas, etc. You know, different dealers have different expertise. So, you know, that would be something else to consider. And, you know, for someone who's just getting into the game, it is always, you know, amazing to me when people are just trying to hunt around when they have absolutely no idea what they're doing. It's a real recipe for disaster. And then I get a lot of Instagram DMs, as you can imagine, from just a variety of people.
That was me a few years ago, mate. That was me pestering you.
People just sending me stuff like, did I do okay when I bought this on eBay? And I'm like, well, if you wanted a fake watch, sure, you did okay, but maybe not. So yeah, so that's the first. And then the other question, best top picks for 2020 pickups.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what the new watches released this year, or yeah. I mean, it's been a strange year for watches anyway, so maybe we should just end it there.
Yeah. Too many questions. Eric's giving away trade secrets at this point.
Well, given it's free tickets as well, you know, we should start charging before Eric starts giving away that kind of proprietary knowledge.
And that Heuer to donate that to the cause is really,
actually, that Heuer's not
generous.
A bad idea. I mean, those Heuer chronos are pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay, I think so first off, like, thanks to the panel. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Matt, my co-host. Thank you to everybody who's been watching live as we've done this conversation, not just once, but 1.5 times. Big thanks to Jonas and Eric for remembering everything they said the first time and managing to say it again with added extras. Thank you so much. We will be back again next week with 2 as yet undecided guests. Matt and I are going to work that out. And yeah, thanks so much for listening. Have a good week, everybody. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye. Stay safe.